Hi everyone, welcome to a new patch notes video. In today's episode I want to address a topic that has been brought up on several occasions during my past Hollow Knight and Silksong videos, and it's specifically connected to the concept of diegetic music versus non-diegetic, and everything that is in between. I think there is some confusion when it comes to diegetic music, as a lot of people somehow get the understanding that every kind of dynamic music idea could potentially be diegetic, but dynamic music and diegetic music are two different things. To break it down, we are essentially dealing with two completely different axes here. The first is narrative ontology, which answered the question, where does the sound exist in the story world? That's your diegetic versus non-diegetic axis. The second is technical mechanics, which answers how does the game engine trigger or modulate this sound? That's your dynamic, adaptive, or interactive audio. Players often fall into a trap where just because a music track reacts to something happening on the screen, they assume it must be physically happening inside the room. Diegetic music basically is music that is present in the game or in the scene, meaning that the audience hears it just as much as the characters in the fictional story do. So it has to be as realistic for the characters in the fiction as it is for us. A very good example of this is the famous scene from Once Upon a Time in America, where Cockeye plays the flute in the street. The melody that it plays is one of the main themes of the film, which will eventually come back again as non-diegetic, played by the orchestra. But during that specific scene, you hear the theme just as much as the fictional characters in the scene do. An example of non-diegetic music is the Imperial March from Star Wars. Nobody in the scene actually hears the Imperial March when Darth Vader appears, right? Only the audience of the movie does. And that ties into the concept of leitmotif and so forth. So I think that's pretty clear. The confusion sometimes arises whenever the composer plays between these two layers. And I specifically want to address the example that has been brought up with Carmelita, the boss fight from Hollow Knight Silksong. So, this is what happens. When you wake up in the dream of Carmelita, you hear her singing from far away. So you, the audience, are hearing it, but Hornet is hearing the voice at the same time. She's attracted to it, right? She reaches the theater and in fact you realize that Carmelita is singing and dancing in front of an audience. At that moment, the music is diegetic, because you, the audience, are hearing the exact same thing that the fictional characters are hearing in the scene. Hornet and all the ant audience in the theater. Then the music starts. The music that begins with the orchestra and so on is non-diegetic. Why? Because you, the audience, are the only ones who actually hear the orchestra playing. And you might argue, well, but we don't know if there's an actual orchestra in the theater that starts playing where her minions attack you. True, but the burden of proof is on you, who claim that to prove it is the case, and not for me to prove that it's not. Until proven to the contrary, we just operate on the assumption that there is no orchestra, because we cannot see one and nobody's actually playing an instrument. The music that is being played highlights the same melody that we heard Carmelita sing. This is a connection. This doesn't mean that the music has become fully diegetic. You might even think that Carmelita is still singing in the background, and that might be true, but at the same time, a major component of the music, the orchestra, is not really present in the scene. So this is bridging music. Music that stays in the middle between diegetic and non-diegetic. In game audio architecture, this is a textbook example of vertical layering, being used to create trans-diegetic or hybrid music. Her vocals act as a stem A, let's say, the diegetic stem, because she's a singer performing on stage, but the orchestra is stem B, the non-diegetic stem, providing the emotional weight and tension of the fight purely for us, the player. The real problem, actually, comes a bit later. As soon as you defeat all the minions, Karmelita comes down to the stage and decides to fight you in person. By that point, you hear the music as before, with the singing part over it. Again, the music is not diegetic because there is no orchestra in the scene. Parts of it can be considered diegetic, because with the singing part, she's there and she is probably singing. We don't know for sure, but we can probably say that if she was singing before, she might be singing and fighting at the same time at that specific moment. And apparently, evidence for this is the fact that whenever you get her stunned, the singing part stops, but the music progresses without the vocal track. And this, for some people, has been, let's say, the ultimate confirmation that this is purely diegetic music. Well, even if this were the case, like I said, it couldn't be purely diegetic music because of the orchestra playing. But even if we set that aside, this doesn't really address the core issue here, because yes, while she's stunned, the singing stops. That is true. On the other hand, everyone knows that while you're fighting here and she attacks, grunts and all, you can hear her grunting and screaming while she's supposedly singing. If the full track were strictly diegetic, her vocals and her combat grunts will logically compete as physical acoustic events. events in the room rather than operating on two distinct audio channels. Or, to make it more clear, you cannot sing and grunt at the same time. So this is proof that we're not really talking about diegetic music here, we're talking about dynamic music. It's a very important difference actually. Modern game audio engines like Fmod or Wise can fade, filter, mute and so on based on a boss's health bar, pause menu, stun state, whatever. Reactivity is purely a dynamic software state. It does not automatically equal diegetic or non-diegetic. What do we mean by dynamic music? We mean that the composer is having some fun here, playing between layers of music inside the scene versus music outside the scene, and creating some interesting, cool effects that remind you of diegetic music and keep you tied to it without actually being it. A more correct way of describing this type of music is hybrid music, meta-diegetic music, or simply source scoring. There's also, and I pointed that out on a previous video, a very interesting interview with Ennio Morricone who specifically talk about this as an effect you can use as a composer to grab the audience's attention, not when music simply appears on the screen, but rather when the composer plays between these two layers. The boundary between the fictional world and the score dissolves, capturing the audience's attention entirely. It's basically like breaking the fourth wall, right? And in fact, Christopher Larkin managed to capture our attention as I'm literally making a video about it, so mission accomplished, I guess. I hope this clarifies a little bit the difference between diegetic music, non-diegetic, and the connection between these two things. And this doesn't mean that what some of you have said about this specific case or other cases is wrong. I think there's just some confusion with the terminology. So I just wanted to point out what the correct terminology is to use and the fact that maybe you have been using the wrong words to say the right things. That's all I have to say about this. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a nice day. Catch up later.